It is a Tuesday morning in Washington. A senior trade official sitting inside the Rayburn House office building is testifying before Congress, reading from a list of conditions that the United States government says must be met before it will agree to renew the most important trade agreement in North America. The list is specific. The list is surgical. And near the very top of that list is one word: dairy. Not steel, not automobiles, not semiconductors. Dairy. And 600 miles north, in Ottawa, Mark Carney, former governor of the Bank of Canada, former governor of the Bank of England, a man who has navigated the collapse of global financial systems and stared down currency crises, hears this demand. And he responds, not in English, in French, deliberately, coldly, calculatedly. He says supply management is not on the table. Let that sink in for a moment. The Trump administration has placed dairy at the center of the most consequential trade renegotiation of the decade. The July 1st, 2026 deadline for the USMCA joint review is now less than 4 months away. Trilateral trade between the United States, Canada, and Mexico reached over $1.9 trillion in 2024. The USMCA market covers 30% of global GDP, and the friction point that could unravel all of it, the pressure point that has Washington and Ottawa locked in a cold war of economic positioning, is milk. This is not a trade dispute. This is a test of power, and what is happening right now, beneath the surface, is bigger than anything you are seeing covered on cable news. Buckle up. Let me explain exactly what Canada's supply management system is, because the mainstream media keeps reducing it to a soundbite about dairy tariffs, and that framing is doing enormous damage to the public's understanding of what is actually at stake here. Canada's supply management system was created in the 1970s. It is a domestic agricultural policy framework that controls the supply of dairy, eggs, and poultry through 3 mechanisms: production quotas, import controls, and administered pricing. The system guarantees Canadian farmers a minimum price for their products. It limits what can be imported. And for anything brought in above a predetermined threshold, called a tariff rate quota, it imposes tariffs that range from 200% to 298%. Canada's cheddar cheese tariff above quota sits at 245.5%. Butter above quota sits at 298.5%. When Donald Trump stands at a podium and says, Canada is ripping American farmers off with 400% dairy tariffs, he is not entirely wrong. But here is what he is not telling you. Those punishing tariffs only apply above the quota. Below the quota, American dairy products enter Canada at 0 tariffs. And here is the part that should make your jaw drop. The United States is not even reaching its 0 tariff quota limits, not in a single dairy category. American dairy producers are not filling the tariff-free access that already exists. In many categories, including fluid milk, the United States is not even at half of its allowed 0 tariff maximum. This is the first receipt. Read it carefully. The actual American grievance is not the headline tariff number. The real grievance, the one that U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer laid out before Congress in December 2025, is about how Canada allocates the existing quota access. Washington argues that Ottawa has engineered the quota allocation system to funnel tariff-free import rights primarily to large Canadian-owned dairy processing companies, firms like Saputo and AgroPur, that have no commercial incentive to import American milk and compete against themselves. So the quota technically exists on paper. In practice, it is commercially unusable. The access is there. The door is open. But the corridor is so narrow, and the room on the other side so carefully arranged, that American producers cannot get through. From Washington's perspective, that is not compliance. That is obstruction disguised as compliance. Now let us talk about who Mark Carney is and why his response to this demand has shocked people inside the Beltway who should have known better. Carney is not a politician in the traditional sense. He is a systems thinker. He was a Goldman Sachs partner for 13 years, and he ran the Bank of Canada through the 2008 financial crisis and then ran the Bank of England through Brexit. This is a man who spent his career managing crises that lesser leaders let detonate. He does not bluster, he does not gesture, he calculates, and then he moves. The critique in Washington is strategic and intellectual, operating on the logic that Carney understands leverage and how to create it, how to sustain it, and how to deploy it at the moment of maximum asymmetric advantage. When Greer finished his testimony before Congress, Carney was asked about supply management. He answered in French. Not because he does not speak English, because the message was not for Washington. It was for Quebec. It was for the farmers in St. Hyacinthe and Drummondville and Victoriaville, whose political mobilization has ended the careers of Canadian politicians for decades. It was a demonstration that he knows exactly which coalition he needs to hold together, and that he is not afraid to signal that to an American audience watching in real time. Supply management, he said, is not on the table. It is not up for negotiation. It has never been. It will never be. Here is what the administration did not anticipate. Canada codified it into law. In June 2025, Bill C-202 passed the Canadian House of Commons unanimously. Every party, every member. This bill, tabled by the Bloc Québécois, amended Canada's Foreign Affairs and a Trade and Development Act to prevent ministers from negotiating away supply management's import controls. It specifically prohibits raising tariff rate quotas for dairy, poultry, or eggs, or lowering tariffs on foreign goods that exceed import quota thresholds. It is now moving through the Senate. Think about what that means structurally. Carney did not need a law to make supply management his negotiating position. He already had the political will. Canada passed the law anyway. What they did was take the negotiating discretion out of the room entirely. Canada did not just say the dairy market is off the table. Canada said here is a piece of legislation that makes it structurally impossible for any Canadian government, current or future, to give ground on this issue. They removed the lever. They eliminated the concession before the negotiation even formally began. In Washington, they are calling this a provocation. In Ottawa, they are calling it a negotiating position. And in the history of trade diplomacy, this move has a name. It is called foreclosure, and it is extraordinarily effective. Now let us talk about the numbers, because this is where the story stops being about politics and starts being about consequences that hit real people in real places. Canada's dairy sector, just dairy, not the entire supply management system, supports 270,000 full-time equivalent jobs. It contributes $28 billion to Canada's GDP annually. It generates $9 billion in federal tax revenue every single year. That is $9 billion every single year that funds Canadian schools, Canadian hospitals, and Canadian infrastructure. The entire supply-managed sector, dairy, eggs, and poultry combined, supports 431,000 full-time jobs and contributes $45.1 billion to Canada's GDP. These are not abstract numbers. These are the veterinarians and the feed suppliers and the truck drivers and the equipment manufacturers and the rural processors in towns across Ontario and Quebec and Alberta who wake up every morning because the dairy supply chain still functions. When politicians in Ottawa talk about defending supply management, they are not just defending farmers. They are defending the economic circulatory system of rural Canada. Here is the hidden connection that nobody is talking about. The dairy fight is not really about dairy. Dairy is the proxy war. What this negotiation is actually about is whether Canada will accept a structural subordination of its domestic agricultural policy to American market preferences as a precondition for renewing a trade agreement that covers $550 billion in annual Canadian merchandise exports to the United States. 3/4 of Canada's total exports go south of the border. That is the gravitational pull that Washington is counting on. That is the pressure differential that the Trump administration believes will force Ottawa's hand. They are operating on the assumption that when Canada stares into the abyss of a collapsed USMCA, when Canadian auto workers in Windsor and steel workers in Hamilton understand what is at stake, the political math will shift. The broader coalition will overwhelm the dairy coalition, and Carney will have no choice but to fold. Here is the problem with that calculation. Canada has done this before, and it survived. When Trump negotiated the original USMCA in his first term, dairy was a central demand. Canada made concessions. It granted expanded tariff rate quotas to American dairy products. It gave the United States more paper access to the Canadian market. And supply management survived. It was not dismantled. It was not fundamentally restructured. It absorbed the hit and continued. And then, under the current negotiation, Washington came back and said the concessions we extracted last time were administered in bad faith. Give us more. That is the cycle Carney is refusing to ratify. He watched what happened in 2018 and 2020. He understands that conceding on dairy in round 1 simply becomes the floor for round 2. The math is merciless. If you give ground on quota allocation today, the next negotiating session begins from that new baseline and asks for more. Canada looked at that dynamic and decided the only rational response was to legally foreclose the negotiation before it began. Now let us talk about the USMCA deadline itself, because this is where the gravity of this situation becomes visible. By July 1st, 2026, the United States, Canada, and Mexico must formally signal whether they intend to extend the USMCA for another 16 years. This is the mandatory 6-year joint review embedded in Article 34.7 of the agreement. If all 3 parties confirm renewal, the deal extends to 2042, with the next review in 2032. If any party does not confirm, the agreement continues on a year-by-year review cycle until 2036, at which point it expires unless extended. And any party can withdraw entirely with 6 months' notice at any time. That countdown begins in 117 days. USTR Greer has already told Congress that a rubber stamp renewal is not in the national interest. He said the review's success depends on the resolution of specific bilateral issues, and Canada's dairy market access is explicitly named as one of those issues. The former Canadian ambassador to the United States, Kirsten Hillman, said as she ended her 6-year posting in February 2026 that she cannot say whether the USMCA review will conclude this year. She said the path will not be straight. That is the diplomatic translation of, nobody knows what happens in July. Nobody in Washington has a map. Now, let us talk about the worst case, because it is no longer theoretical. It is being modeled. If the USMCA review collapses, if the United States declares the agreement not worth extending and triggers its withdrawal, the consequences cascade across the North American economy in ways that are almost impossible to fully price. The USMCA exemption currently shields more than 90% of Canadian exports to the United States from Trump's 35% fentanyl levy. 90%. That exemption disappears the moment USMCA protection disappears. The automotive sector, integrated so deeply across the Canada-US-Mexico production chain that a single car crosses the border 8 times before it is finished, would be hit with tariffs that would make North American vehicles uncompetitive in the global market. The steel and aluminum flows, the softwood lumber, the agricultural supply chains, the energy corridors, all of it suddenly exposed. Patrick LeBlond, a professor at the University of Ottawa's Graduate School of Public and International Affairs, described the American position this way. "It sounds like," he said, "the United States is putting a gun to your head and saying, you are going to give us what we want. And that number, the number of what a collapsed USMCA would cost Canada, should terrify you more than any headline." But here is what makes this story more complicated than the way Washington is reading it. The United States has its own dairy protectionism. The US maintains its own tariff rate quota system for dairy imports. Tariff-free access for foreign dairy products into the United States is tightly controlled, and for anything above quota the tariffs are steep. Mussel, a senior research fellow at the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute, made this precise point in an interview with CNN. The US, he said, has precisely the same system for its dairy market, tariff rate quotas, and beyond that volume, very stiff tariffs and almost no imports. This is the asymmetry that cable news is not covering. Washington is demanding that Canada dismantle a system that Washington itself operates. It is demanding open dairy market access in the name of free trade while maintaining import barriers in its own agricultural sector. The dairy farmers of Canada said explicitly in 2025 that the United States ships more American dairy products to Canada than flow the other way. This is not about market share. This is about leverage. This is about establishing the principle that American domestic policy is sacrosanct, while Canadian domestic policy is a negotiating chip. Mark Carney looked at that principle, and he refused it. In French, let us talk about the political fallout inside Canada, because that dimension of this story is being completely missed by the American media. Canada just came through a federal election in which every major political party, Liberal, Conservative, NDP, Bloc Québécois, explicitly committed to protecting supply management. Every single one. This is a system that has survived NAFTA negotiations, TPP negotiations, USMCA Round 1, and multiple cycles of American pressure over 4 decades. The dairy lobby in Canada is among the most sophisticated and politically organized in any democracy in the world. Carney is not defending supply management because he loves milk quotas. He is defending it because the political cost of conceding on it, the coalition fracture, the Quebec realignment, the rural seat hemorrhage, would be catastrophic to any government that made that concession. He knows this. That is why the law was passed. That is why the answer came in French. Now, pay close attention. Pay. Here is the trajectory you need to understand. The USMCA review is not a single event. It is a process. And what is happening right now, the hardening of positions, the legislative foreclosure, the deliberate public signals, is the opening phase of a negotiation that will determine the structural relationship between the United States and Canada for the next 16 years. What Carney is betting on is that the American business community, the automakers and the manufacturers, and the agricultural exporters, and the retailers who depend on integrated North American supply chains, will apply their own pressure on the Trump administration before July 1st. That the gravitational pull of $1.9 trillion in trilateral trade is too powerful for even a man with a social media account to reroute unilaterally. That bet may be correct, but it requires the American business community to move faster than American politics, and that is not a guarantee. Watch for 3 things. First, watch whether the Senate passes Bill C-202, the supply management protection legislation, before the June 1st deadline when governments are supposed to submit recommended changes to the USMCA Free Trade Commission. If that bill becomes law before the formal review opens, Carney arrives at the table with zero formal authority to make dairy concessions. The negotiating position is legally frozen. Second, watch whether the Trump administration escalates to sector-specific tariffs on Canadian dairy products specifically. On July 10, 2025, Trump threatened a 35% blanket tariff on Canadian goods unless a revised trade agreement was finalized by August 1st. That deadline passed without the threatened tariff materializing. But the threat is still live. A targeted dairy tariff designed to punish Canada's supply management without triggering the broader USMCA collapse would be the pressure instrument Washington reaches for if the current standoff holds. Third, watch Mexico. The United States and Mexico began formal CUSMA restructuring discussions on January 28, 2026. If Mexico makes concessions on agricultural access in exchange for tariff relief on manufactured goods, and Washington may try to isolate Canada, to use the Mexico deal as a template and tell Ottawa that the terms are already set, take them or leave them. These are not hypothetical scenarios. They are live chess moves, and the pieces are already in motion. Zoom out for a moment. What is happening between Washington and Ottawa right now is not a trade dispute in the conventional sense. It is a fundamental argument about the sovereignty of domestic policy in an integrated trading relationship. The question being litigated, over milk quotas of all things, is whether a smaller country in a bilateral trade relationship with a much larger economy retains the right to protect its own domestic agricultural architecture when that architecture is inconvenient to its trading partner. Canada says yes, Washington says the price of market access is policy alignment, and Carney has responded by saying, in French, that some things are not for sale. History is instructive here. When British manufacturing began relocating to the American colonies in the late 18th century, Parliament tried tariffs and export bans on machinery and skilled workers. It did not work. Capital found a way. The pattern of a smaller economy protecting domestic industries from a larger neighbor's competitive pressure is as old as trade itself. Every time the pressure has been absolute, the smaller economy has found a way to absorb it, reroute around it, or outlast it. Canada has supply management because it watched what happens to agricultural sectors that lose price stability. It watched American dairy farmers, subsidized by the federal government and exposed to global price volatility, cycle through boom and collapse. It decided that stability was worth the price of access restriction. That calculation has survived 40 years of American displeasure. Whether it survives 2026 is the question. The relationship Canada thought it had with the United States, Carney said, is over. What replaces it is being decided right now in the space between a trade representative's testimony to Congress and a Prime Minister's answer delivered in a second language. Subscribe. Stay tuned. Because what happens next, whether Washington blinks, whether Carney holds, whether the USMCA survives its first genuine test of political will, is not just about dairy quotas and tariff schedules. It is about whether the architecture of North American trade is stable, or whether it has become, in this era, something that can be renegotiated from the top down by a single determined administration with a deadline. The empire does not always collapse under external pressure. Sometimes the more dangerous force is the one already inside the room, holding the pen, rewriting the terms. Pay attention. History is moving fast.